Okay, top-down processing and the PFC. So, and you might delete these if you like, but I do like just to keep going over these because more repetition, they're going to less likely to forget it. And especially when we've got such a big unit with so much jam-packed, it's nice always just to keep it sequential where we've been. Alright, so last lesson we said genetics might be a risk factor for low hippocampus. Today we're looking at how the prefrontal cortex might be involved in PTSD. The amygdala, hippocampus, prefrontal cortex. Three key parts of the brain I think all high school psychology students should know about by the time they graduate, because they're the three most commonly studied parts of the brain, and also they are just happen to be the three most commonly involved in PTSD, so I think they're pretty key. Now, this is the finding in people with PTSD is they have reduced function and reduced volume in their ventromedial prefrontal cortex. Now, we want students to be able to explain link that with the symptoms of PTSD. I think that's a good thing to remember when we're having to explain what is PTSD. Well, it's the symptoms. So you can't explain etiology or prevalence or an explanation of PTSD without you explicitly explaining why those symptoms come about. And different symptoms will have different explanations. Okay. Now this is again, so knowing the symptoms is essential in explaining PTSD. So reviewing and recapping these as much as possible, I think, is pretty good. Okay, so this can be an optional additional one, depends on how much time you have. You might want to come back, do it at the end of the lesson if you're not sure if you'll have enough time. But you can give the name of a study, and they give one question to recap a key detail about that study. So, and they can do this with each other, or you can give them a study, say, right, this is your, they're writing the quiz questions. So you're doing Peterson, you're doing HM, you're doing Sapolsky, you're doing Gilbertson, and they write down one key question, they submit it in, and then you ask that question and quiz the students that way. But again, it takes a few minutes, so you might find that you might want to do it later, or just wait and see if you've got the time. Okay, this is just a 2-minute video that shows how the brain can change as a result of trauma. And now, here's where I like to give a demonstration of the top-down generation of emotion. So top-down processing of emotion means that our emotion doesn't come from what we see in our environment, and then we think about it. It comes from our thoughts, and then that is having an effect on our brain, which is then causing the emotion. Now, in the activities files, there's a description of, there are 2 different descriptions of what's happening in this photo. Print them out and give half of the descriptions to half the students and the other half to the other. So half the students are going to think that I said this girl is asleep, and the other half are going to know the truth, that this is a Jewish girl in the ghettos in Poland and she's starving or has starved to death. Now, what they're going to do is they're going to rank their feelings when they look at this picture. What this is, hopefully, those that know the truth are going to rate this as being much more emotional than those that think she's just having a sleep. And what we're looking at here, and so you can count up the scores, average them out and compare, and then now you can talk about top-down generation of emotion. This is the emotional stimulus. It's the exact same for both participants, but for both groups of students. But one group has a much higher emotional reaction to it because of the way they're thinking about the image, and that's top-down processing of emotion, top-down generation. The other example I like to give, that I like to use, I might stop doing it, it's pretty taxing. There's a still image of a CCTV photo of a young boy in Britain who was murdered about 30 years ago. He's about 2 or 3 years old, and he was led out the shopping mall by 2 other boys who committed a brutal attack on him. I sort of tell that story and show the image. It's a the CCTV is very, very harmless like this. I'm going to stop talking about it because it's going to get me emotional now. But in class, students can actually see the emotion generate in my face. I mean, I can't help but lose it because my son's the same age. And then I have to calm myself down again, and that's kind of it makes for a very taxing but good demonstration of top-down processing. So if you have something like that gets you every time, I don't think it's I think it's a good thing to show that side of emotion, show that humanity in the classroom. Anyway, bit of chalk and talk, right? What top-down processing is, and then maybe using something like a snake can be a good example. Alright, again, using a real-life example to try and explain symptoms. So, I've got Due here. He's a Vietnamese man, fought in the Vietnamese War. There are some details of him in the workbook. I think there is a blog post here that has the details. And what we're trying to do is, how could you explain his intrusive memories? So when we're talking about symptoms of PTSD, it often gets very abstract because we're just talking about any possible explanation. But when we make it a very concrete one, I think hopefully it's going to help students really make the connections there. So they want to be able to explain, how could low function ventral medial prefrontal cortex explain the link there. And so here it might be a bit of chalk and talk if they need it. And the answer here is simply, right, if we don't have volume or activity, if our prefrontal cortex is not working properly, then we have a lack of executive control. So, our central executive might not work as well. We can't control the thoughts that are coming in and out of our conscious attention, in and out of our working memory, right? And so that could explain intrusive memories. With the way we just get memories, I didn't want to think about that. I didn't want to think about that, my traumatic childhood just now, but it just came in there because I lack the control, because that's what my prefrontal cortex does. That's one explanation. But what we're going to use the evidence in the next lesson, that's really looking at top-down control. And so if we have a lack of top-down control, so if I can't down-regulate my emotions, if I can't control my emotions, and that also means controlling the activation of my amygdala from my prefrontal cortex, I'm going to have increased arousal. So my arousal levels are going to maintain higher because my amygdala is going to keep activating. This could lead to not only increased anxiety, could also lead to avoidance, right? If I want to avoid the places and things and people that are going to raise my emotion because I know I can't control it. And so that could also, being avoided and cutting off from people, could lead to depression as well. And so you see now our explanations are getting a little bit more complex. If that was all too much, we've got more time in the next lesson to cover it again. Okay, so reflect. So here, I think they can use highlighters or color cards. These are 3 possible etiologies of PTSD, and see how well they could explain them. And this could be a good turn and talk activity as well, right? They talk about this as a group. What you can say, I think if they were to have one biological etiology, I think they can talk about the brain. Then they can talk about the amygdala, the hippocampus, and the ventral medial prefrontal cortex, and all those supporting studies. So say, what is one biological etiology of PTSD? Abnormalities in the brain. I don't like using the word abnormalities. We could just say activity in the brain activity, the brain. But yeah, anyway, abnormality in the brain is perhaps the easier way to say it. Okay, so next lesson we're going to look at the evidence that backs up, shows the role of the PFC in cognitive reappraisal and the study.